someone just, so then you see it here. So every year when the budget speech is published, you'll see the proposal come out at the end of the budget speech. These appendixes all come from the Bahagian Cukai, or the tax division of the ministry. So it shows that this is how the policy, something that comes from policy and idea, turns into law, in fact, or even a tax policy. This is involved and still involved in various policy moves. The one on the left is looking at how to make Malaysia a better destination for international students. And the Ministry of Higher Education right now, as we speak, is still currently has embarked on trying to formulate strategies for the country. On the right-hand side, you see the Majlis Tibet Negara, or the National Tibet Council, which also looks at how do we improve the Tibet space for the country, because, you know, Felix, I know you do accountancy. That's also sort of like a skill, right? And it's a professional paper. Whereas in many developed countries, you have something like 70% of students in Tibet, 30% in academic pathways. But in Malaysia, it's the other way around. It's only 30% in Tibet and many in academic pathways. So I think if I asked you Tibet, you might say, oh, not very attractive. It's not seen as something that's, you know, oh, it's not like being an engineer or a lawyer or a doctor, right? But it's actually very important for the country to function. So that's a little bit of what I do as well. Now I'm back in the corporate sector, and my role is amazing. You know, at the Sunway University, Sunway Education Group, which is owned and run by the Jeffrey Chia Foundation. So I've got to plug my employees here too, right? And and it is, of course, as you know, one of the largest social enterprises in and of itself. Is a charitable endowment in that regard, and one of the best, or one of the biggest in the country. That aside, what I also do is I write for the Star newspaper. And I use that as a policy to share policy. And I was actually invited in 2014 when I was in government to write, because what you realize is there are not many people who write about what happens in government, right? There are a lot of things that we don't know. So this article was Special Chefs in an Inspired Kitchen, which is calling for more support for handicapable students, especially in Tibet. The students you see here have got different types of disabilities, hearing, some of it's learning. But what they do is they learn how to be baristas. So I don't know, you know, whether any of you in the audience have been to our, you know, there's a Starbucks, I believe, or a Coffee Bean in Bangsa Village, and you may see a tag where they say that, you know, I'm deaf, for example. And some of them might have been trained at our Tibet institutions, our community colleges, particularly one in Selayang. And at the same time, also using platforms nowadays like social media to talk about policy developments. So recently, sometime in the middle of last year, I wrote this article on mental health where I interviewed my former colleague who was a civil servant about her experience battling suicide. And she shared that in the last 10 years, there's been a marked improvement. So again, you know, we tend to be very hard on our government for being slow when it comes to certain things. And of course, nothing's perfect. But the reality is when you hear it from somebody who's had these mental health challenges, she has been able to vouch that's been an improvement, you know, but clearly that's an ongoing process. And on the side, I'm also a part-time host with Bernama. And this is something that I do from time to time. What you see here is an interview on Budget 2022, and where we were able to interview a number of economists from the World Bank. There's Professor Raja Rasya, and in fact, Arman, if you see the picture at the bottom, he was recently a recipient of Malaysia's Rhodes Scholarship. So, you know, although I'm no longer in government and directly in policy, but I'm very, very much still excited by it. So the conclusion of part one, do let me know if I'm talking too fast, Felix, is making policy accessible is as important as producing the policy itself. Number two, being driven by data is important, no doubt about that, but so is empathy and heart. Number three, sincere engagement with and listening to stakeholders is challenging, but it's often underappreciated part of the process. So a lot of work actually went on behind the scenes in all this. And of course, number four, there's wisdom in hindsight, whether regret or joy. And what I mean by that is, you know, a lot of things are done and they may not always work. But then when you look back, you know, if it went well, you've learned from something good. If it doesn't go well, then you know what went wrong and you hopefully improve for the future. So that's a little bit about part one. Okay, are you all good so far in the audience? I see if you all are good, maybe you can put a thumbs up or something in the chat box so I can see some interaction, or I'm assuming everybody's just so intently listening at the start. Thank you. All right. So let's move on to part 2, which is conceptualizing a policy brief. And here we'll have a bit of an exercise for all of you. So I hope all of you have maybe a pen and paper on standby. So what is a policy? A policy is a statement of intent, usually but not always made by the government, that describes a problem, and it broadly outlines how the problem will be addressed. So it doesn't always have to be policy is government policy. A policy may also refer to all these things: proposal, outcome, formal discussion, bundle of legislation, and even an absence. So don't always look at policy from a government perspective. It could be NGO crafted, it could be individual crafted, it could be writing, or it could be something that even people say. And what are policy briefs? Policy briefs are key tools to present research and recommendations to non-specialized audiences. They are a vehicle for providing evidence-based advice to help readers make informed decisions. Strong policy briefs distill research finding in plain language and draw clear links. So, and ultimately, it's about how does one influence policymakers. And I'm just sharing this to give you all an overview because the title of this talk is Introduction to Public Policy. And what's in the name, right? Of course, there are many names to a policy. There's report, research paper, policy paper, briefing analysis, memo, brief, all sorts, and they come in all sorts and sizes. I don't want to go into too many details here. Happy to share these slides after the session as well. And depending on the type of policy that's produced, whether it's a paper or a brief, the audience, focus, context, methodology, ideas, and length also vary. Of course, studies are more in depth. So the study that I shared earlier about internationalization was almost 400 pages long, but the policy brief of that is probably only 8 pages long, which is a summary. So the question is, and I'm also highlighting because I know many of you here might participate in the myIMPACT pitching competition, which I hope that you do, or might yourself be involved in various entities like universities who want to provide consultancy or policy advisory to governments. And I think this is also where you think about why you're doing this and how you're doing this. Now, the question is, how effective are these briefs, right? And some research that I was able to find says that 79% of policy actors from developing and developed countries rated policy briefs as key tools. And when you're in government, you're also always looking forward to what external individuals have to say. And that's one way of those of you in government to understand what's happening. And on average, policy actors spend 30 to 60 minutes reading a policy brief. Therefore, making it easily digestible increases the likelihood of it being acted upon. I know we've got some academics here today, and I think when I mention this, there's also mindful of how we love producing publications, right? But I will say that oftentimes these publications don't get translated into real policy action. And I think that's something we have to think about. Yeah. Oh, and thanks for the thumbs up for those in the chat box. All right. So there are a few key components of policy briefs, and I just want to run this by everyone because after this, we're going to have an activity. So firstly is when you want to craft a policy, you must know the context and the problem. You must identify, elaborate, and describe. And the explanation to this is you need to carefully define the context and problem with relevant and sufficient detail. Number two, it can be framed as a specific question that needs answering. All right, policy options. Once you have the context and problem, you must then look at what are your policy options or your choices, right? These are the choices for addressing the policy problem. If policy exists, that means if it's already there, what works and what doesn't? If a new policy is needed, how do you assess it? And benchmark. Now, benchmarking is very important. How are other countries doing it? And what can we emulate? So I know for those of you who Google up how to craft policy, you've got things like SWOT analysis, TOES analysis. You even have just all sorts of tools available, and and all these tools are very valuable in some ways or the other. Third, you need to have a criteria for judging or assessing the policy, and this is often overlooked. So what does this mean? So once you have a policy idea, how do you assess whether it's good or not, whether it have cost implications or not? So if you look here on the elaboration bit, It's often overlooked. It is vital for decision makers to know the reasons for recommending one policy over another. An example of criteria categories include evaluation criteria, which is efficiency and fairness. So is a policy efficient? Is a policy fair? And a practical criteria, is it legal and is it politically acceptable? And as you all know, when you say whether something is politically acceptable, then it can be very gray, right? And of course, the note here is some criteria might be more important than others. For example, whether it's legal or not. So, unless you don't have to change a law, which then you may be, especially if it involves changing laws and going to parliament. If it's not, or doesn't involve changing laws, then you have to look at what's the political implications. And don't worry, we'll get to an exercise after this. And last but not least is a policy recommendation, which is what would you tell the policymaker whether it should or shouldn't? So please take a moment, members of the audience, to digest it and just sort of give this some thought. And I'll share with you a template shortly. I'm going to take a quick sip. Okay, of my teh tarik. It's a very Malaysian thing, yeah. So this is an example, and I think we learn better by looking at the examples. So if you start at the top right here, I've got a laser pointer. The policy question, this is just an example, yeah. What should our town do to improve voter participation? The problem is people are not coming out to vote. And these are your policy options. Option A, pay people to vote. Option B, schedule local elections on days when few people work. So if people can't take leave, they are more likely, if they don't have to take leave, they might come out. Or C, increase spending on public messages encouraging voting. So remember, you've got your context, you've got your policy options, and now you've got your assessment criteria. So legal, pay people to vote. Is it legal? It's not legal. Therefore, it might require a change of laws. Is it cost effective? Probably not, because it's going to be very expensive to pay all the electorate. Is it inclusive? The policy affects the broadest range of voters, meaning when you have this policy, most number of people will be impacted. The answer is yes. Then would you recommend it? Probably not. And I think for those of you who are with us, you probably can guess that's because it's going to be really expensive, right, to pay people to come out and vote. Policy choice B, is it legal? Yes. Is it cost effective? Neutral, because the election has to happen regardless. Is it inclusive? Probably, because you assume that if you do it on a day where it's unlikely people work, which is like, say, a Sunday or a Saturday, right? Then chances of them coming out. But then, of course, in Malaysia, sometimes Saturday, Sundays are weekends, sometimes it's Fridays and Saturdays. So that's a consideration. Policy C, and sort of the process goes. Is it legal? Yes. Cost effective? Yes. Inclusive? Yes. Would you recommend it? Probably yes. So these are sort of how it's done. Okay. Now, what I would like you all to do is I'm going to give everybody about, let's say, 5 minutes to read this article. It's an article published in The Star in 2019. And I'd like you all to take 5 minutes just to digest it. And after this, we're going to do an exercise based on this article. So if you have like a pen and paper, that'll be quite good to have. Or if you're dual screening this, then open an MS Word or something like that. Okay, so your 5 minutes starts now. Mute myself. 2 more minutes. Well, just under 2 minutes. Felix, have you finished reading?
Yeah, I've done reading. Am I part of this exercise too, right?
Pardon? Yes, you are. You are.
Okay.
I might just call you out later.
Okay, sure. I'll try my best.
Okay, great. Okay. A minute. Okay, so I hope all of you have read this. It's quite an interesting piece, and it's definitely a challenge that we have. And now we move on to the exercise bit. So what I'd like you all to do is I'm going to put a template in the link in the chat box, which leads to a Google Drive. You can download it from there. And what I'd like all of you to do is think of the context, try to identify 2 or 3 problems that you can extract from this news article. Then think yourself what potential policy options are for those problems that you've identified. Then number 3, how would you assess them? But for this exercise, only use these 3: legal, efficiency, and political, right? So don't worry about any other assessment criteria. And then last but not least is, what's your policy recommendation? Yes or no? Very simple, right? Okay. So I'm going to drop the link in the chat box now. So feel free to access it. I think my next slide also has, let me just jump in quickly. Yeah, so it's you're going to kind of look like this, do one problem, talk about the policy, talk about the criteria. Oops, and of course that. Yeah, so but what I'll do is I'll go back to the article so that all of you can refer to that, okay? Okay, so I give you 5 minutes to read to digest, because I didn't want you thinking about these 4 points first. Now I'm giving everybody the 4, and let's try to sort of do it. And just 2 or 3 is good enough, and I've passed you the link there. Okay, so I'm gonna, thanks, Dr. Adams. And I'm gonna now leave you for another, I would say I'm gonna give it 6 minutes, and I'd like you all to try to do the policy construct based on the slides that I've given. Okay. Of course, I can't see everyone's faces, so I'm going to just rely. I'm just going to hope everyone is busily doing the exercise. Okay, it's been 6 minutes. Felix, are you done?
I'm not fully done, but I think I have a grasp of it.
Okay, so no worries. What I'll do is, if those of you who want, you can screen cap the article and just put it on the side. Because what we're going to do next is we would just go through some potential problems, because I think there's, because there's so many of you, that there's a chance some of you will have different problems. And also, in the interest of time, usually in a physical workshop setting, then I'll probably give a little bit more time, sometimes even up to half an hour, and really so that we can digest it, because there's so many of you here. Yeah. Okay, so let me then move on to the next few slides. So again, this is it. I hope you all found some potential interesting answers. So let's go through it one by one. It's like a together, okay? So one problem is abuse and victimization of international students in Malaysia. Now, how many of you had identified that as a problem? Felix, did you get that one?
Yeah, definitely. Okay, that was the first one.
So that was the first one. I think that's sort of right in your face. Dr. Wieland, that's right. You're right. Very good. So a potential question if you want to flip it, you can always say, how do we ensure international students in Malaysia are not victimized by the authorities? And the potential context, both extracted from the report and not, is there were allegations of abuse of power. They at times mistake legitimate international students for illegal immigrants. Authorities do not recognize official documentation, such as passports. And this is an assumption that we can make, is sometimes students don't carry their passports because it could get lost. That document really is their everything, right? And other times passports are at the immigration department for renewal processing. I don't know, some of you might have friends or yourself been in situations where the processing took so long that I actually had a friend who was able to do a short course in the time. So that goes to some of the challenges that we face. So that's the first problem. Another problem you could have identified is what had happened harms Malaysia's ability to attract international students. So I don't know, Felix, did you see that one? Did anyone else get that?
I didn't take that in much, because that's much more of a bigger perspective, right? So yep. I did mostly on the smaller section of it.
All right. That's right. So Dr. Wieland says reputation of Malaysia may spoil. Arif says spot on. So potential question is, how do we protect and enhance Malaysia's ability to attract international students? Possible context extracted from the report is it creates a perception that Malaysia is not a welcoming place to international students. and many students convey this to their friends who are then deterred. And mind you, ambassadors are very important, right? Alumni who go home and they say, I had a great opportunity, I had a great time in Malaysia, great experience. They influence their scholarship providers, they influence all sorts of people on coming to Malaysia next. And you know, in the article, the last point here, it also says embassies are also sent on a wild goose chase. So these are some of the real problems that are being faced on the ground, right? And even tourism sector may be victimized, as Dr. Whelan has said. Okay, so here are the policy options. So earlier we talked about abuse and international. Possible policy options, creation of SOPs for enforcement authorities. Those of you in the audience, if you want to throw your potential policy options, feel free. I'll just put it out. So if we look at this one here, creation of SOPs for enforcement authorities when dealing with international students. Number 2, create a multi-party task force to oversee international student issues consisting of maybe education institutions, police, immigration, ministries, and embassies. Or number 3, provide easy to carry identity documentation as an alternative to passports. So that's also another potential policy option. For the second problem, which is harming ability to attract, maybe we want to create an entity to manage international branding, or maybe we want to open promotional offices overseas. So Felix, did you get any of these policy options, particularly for problem 1?
For the first problem, yes, I actually had all of those 3.
Oh, fantastic.
I just didn't touch on the second problem. That's where I couldn't. It's more like the Malaysia. I didn't think of the reputation part, but I'm more thinking of the whole system itself. There was so many weaknesses.
Fantastic. I should have asked you first. So I hope some of you in the audience, you've got this. Feel free to drop it into the chat box. Don't be shy, you know, and do that. Okay. So now that we've got the policy, we've identified the problem and the context, the policy option. Let's look at potential criteria or assessment of the policy. Okay, so let's go problem. So problem 1, then criteria, legal. We just go through one by one. So policy option was creation of SOPs for enforcement authorities when dealing with international students. Is it legal? Yes, shouldn't be a problem to create a guideline. What are the efficiency or cost implications? It's minimal cost implication to come out because it's about communication. It's just coming out, creating a manual. How is it politically? Probably neutral, not really any much impact, because in fact, it would be good for relationships with embassies whose students are affected, because now an embassy knows if somebody calls them, they will be able to know what the process is. Okay, so second policy option is a multi-task force. Is it legal? It needs to be checked because you might be sharing sensitive information, there might be security matters, etc., etc. What about the cost? There's no cost because it's just having a platform. Is it political? Yes, because potentially if the task force involves government and non-government entities, then you know what if there's a disagreement, and how does that get communicated, and what kind of image does that send? Again, we're not taking a judgment here on the policy in terms of whether it's right or wrong. We're just talking about the implications, and recommend, maybe need further evaluation. Policy option 3, the one that we highlighted earlier, provide easy to carry identity documentation for international students. Is it legal? We probably need to update it because passports are recognized legally as the official documentation, like our ICs. Is it cost efficient? Is there cost implication? Answer is yes, because you know we need to procure the identity document, someone has to print it, somebody has to create it, so there's all these costs potentially involved. Is it political? Not really, but it could invite political interest, if you know what I mean. See, a launch event, not gazetted, and now there's a gap, right? So the question here is, why do you think it took almost 3 years for the iCard to be gazetted? Maybe you can write your thoughts in the comment section. And the second question is, why this delay, despite the presence of the then Deputy Prime Minister, who was also, etc., and all these thoughts. So for, you know, I'll give you all maybe 30 seconds to maybe digest it and think what could have gone wrong. Of course, let's keep this PC. Dr. Whelan says structural issues. Shaikh said publicity. Anyone else has any thoughts? Chi Kwan says too much red tape in the whole process, from policy to drafting to enforcement. Dr. Adams, very interesting point. Maybe interagency rivalry. Helmi, laziness. Yeah, let's keep this kosher. No, that's right. conflicting interests between departments. Aiman, very interesting point there. Ethan, who will take responsibility for the workload. Very good, very good. Uncoordinated internal stakeholders from Farhan. Yep, very good point. Any more? Okay, so one thing you would have noticed, or what do we notice? I remember this process very well because I was actually in a number of these meetings, political interest, need time to deal between countries. One of the things I remember was there was a question, right? What happens if the students get the cards and the student is stopped by the police and the police don't want to believe that the card is legitimate? So I remember at the meeting, someone had said, the solution is simple. We'll get the IGP as well as the Director of Immigration to sign the back of the cards, to put a chop there. And as you can see here, this is a sample of the card, right? It's a sample only. It actually is there. Now, I've not seen an iCard in the last year or so, so I'm assuming it's still there. So we thought that by having these signatures, it'd still be authoritative. But somehow it still isn't. Like what you see, as everyone has mentioned, the gaps are there. Well, I mean, obviously, Dr. Vilun, if they retire, then it just changes. That means a new IGP. It's kind of like the governor of Bank Negara, right? When the new governor comes in, new circulated notes will have the new governor's signature, right? But the point is this: so even when the card was issued, when the police looked at it, some of them wouldn't believe it, and that was a problem. And many of you have highlighted a good point, right? It could be political interest, it could be it could be lack of communication, because now you have high level, but how does it go to the ground for the police constables who, may have not seen the news, right? Okay, so let's return to our exercise, and I'm just going to speed it up a little bit more at this point here. Okay, so let's remember part 2. Problem 2 that we highlighted earlier was it harms Malaysia's ability to attract international students. And we talked about policy options to create an entity to manage international brands. So in Australia, for example, they've got IDP. In Germany, there's DAAD. And the criteria, we said, yes, it's legal. Financial, yes, there's also cost implications. And politically, that's unlikely, but good for network building. So would you recommend it? Yes. But ladies and gentlemen, it's been done, and it's been done for almost 10 years, right? Yeah, Sencha Aiman said poor execution. Yeah, I mean, there's all of these. You're not wrong, So 2012, there's something created. Felix, have you heard of Education Malaysia Global Services, EMGS?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So they're quite well known, and I've got a lot of friends there. They do a lot of things for the international students. It's been a long journey from their setup in 2012. So I just highlighted some key points, right? They were set up in 2012 April, so it's going to be 10 years soon, to make Malaysia an education hub of choice, top 10. It was meant to have a one-stop center for international students. And together, Education Malaysia and EMGS, two different entities, yeah, best of best, right? That was in 2012. And then in 2014, you actually saw changes. So the iCard successes have been achieved. Malaysia, this is an ISEF monitor, which is a well-known sort of portal or that tracks international student news. That says Malaysia competing for a greater share of international students. So UNESCO's recent recognition, top 10 post, goal is 250,000 by 2025. I can tell you we're definitely not going to achieve it. Since 2014, Malaysia has jumped in the rankings of UNESCO's latest international student mobility survey from 12th place to 9th place. Okay, so I see Khalid writing something. So I'll get back to you, Khalid, yeah, because it's quite long. I think everyone else can see it as well. But so this is what happened in 2016. So if we were to just pause here, we'll probably say, yeah, EMGS has that's an EMGS, mind you, is the product of a policy decision to create an entity to make internationalization of students better. And there seems to be some successes. However, in 2017, we have now witnessed its challenging moments, right? And I remember I was in government at that point. I was actually working with Elroy and Ian and the Star Rage on this, where they actually did an expose on how some colleges would actually misuse their licenses to bring in students and to abuse them. So this picture is, full credit to Star Rage, the links at the bottom. And this was one of the challenges And I remember he had approached me in government to say, can we get some support from government? So if you look at the news, we actually said Ministry of Higher Education was fully supportive of the Star Rages expose. In fact, if you look at the news, 4 colleges had their licenses revoked, and then I think 6 or 7 more. So it did lead to colleges being revoked and licenses being taken away. But what this shows is it shows that in trying to scale up the number of international students coming in, and that was a good policy, EMGS as a policy, they had its dark side, which was the abuse. So you see, and not too long ago, there were obviously structural challenges after weaknesses detected. There were some issues with corruption, and these are all reported up there. Okay, but rain or shine, work must go on. And in 2021, there was this news how in March, number of applications increased by 120%. And I just did a quick news search while preparing for this talk. And as of 1st of January, there was a headline which said 40,000 applications received from international students to continue studies in Malaysia as of end of last year. So, okay, looks good. Policy is still ongoing. Okay, so take a deep breath. Let's summarize part 2. So when coming up with policy, there are obviously many things to consider. First, the short and medium and long-term impact of the policy. And why I like using internationalization, EMGS as a case study is because all of you here watching could see that 10-year journey of being created, ICARD's problems, students coming in, student trafficking, yet rain or shine, PAC, blah, blah, blah. So that shows you the sort of the breadth of it, right? Then you also talk about number 2, when you create mechanisms, you need to create mechanisms to monitor, support, and change where necessary. So in MOF, there's Laksana, which does tracking of the stimulus packages and budget. Once upon a time, there was Pemandu. Number 3, we need to engage with stakeholders and understand where the gaps are and whether measures are being skewed or abused, like you saw the student trafficking. And number 5, recognize the frustrations, and we must have courage to improve. People say Malaysia is very good at coming up with strategies and plans. I agree, but we do tend to fall short when it comes to implementation. And that's both structural, but also a talent issue as well. But I won't go into that now. Okay, so I hope that was interesting. Let's do a quiz. So time check, we've got about half an hour more, which is just nice to kind of smooth into it. So I hope everyone who's with us today, you're enjoying it so far. Let's now do a few quizzes, and it's a policy quiz. Okay, I think I've got 5 questions, yeah? Let's go. So in the 1950s, and get your pens ready. I mean, you don't really need to do much, just sort of pay attention, I suppose. So in the 1950s, China experienced food shortages due to droughts and floods that resulted in widespread famine. To overcome shortages, their policy options included A, modernize farming techniques using science and technology, B, providing grants to farmers with guaranteed purchase incentives, and C, blame sparrows for eating their grain and embark on a nationwide campaign to exterminate them. Which options were pursued? So, yep, please put your comments in the box. While that happens, I'm also just going to look at Khalid's comments. Okay. Thanks, Khalid, for your comments. I've just read it, and we can talk about a little bit about that later. Okay, C, I know, not sure. A,
seems like C is a very popular answer.
C, famous answer C. This person called Jabe Good. Okay. Okay, so I think Dr. Adams, A and B. You can't do A and B, that's cheating.
So many C's?
So many C's. Okay, and the answer is C. Blame sparrows for eating grain and about a nationwide campaign to exterminate them. For pest campaign, Azrael. So this is a bit of explanation. Chairman Mao, this was quite a long while ago, mobilized the entire population to embark on a nationwide campaign to kill sparrows. Locals banged pots and beat drums until birds fell from the sky due to exhaustion. The impact is about almost 500 sparrows were believed to have been exterminated. However, sparrows also eat insects, and with the primary predator gone, locust population ballooned. and it was said that between 15 to 55 million people estimated to have died from the starvation. So the lesson is, some policies can be bad, although they are successfully implemented and can have disastrous consequences. Again, I'm not trying to belittle any government or any entity here, because we all have our ups and downs, right? But this is an example. So if you look this up, you can also find it here. Iza says it also play as a factor for one-child policy. That's possible. I've not read into those details yet. So I'm also open to being corrected, or people want to add in your anecdotes.